Right. Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, well, welcome to this evening. My name is Jacob Reynolds. I'm the partnerships manager at the Academy of Ideas and one of the conveners of this international salon. And as many of you hopefully know, well, we at the Academy of Ideas, we organize public events and debates on a range of themes. And after a long spell online, we have recently been delighted to return to in-person events, most notably our Battle of Ideas festival events, which ran towards the end of last year. But as much as we've enjoyed being together in person, there's no denying that being online has a number of advantages, especially for international themes such as this one. So we will continue. We wanted to continue running some online events and set up this international salon as a forum for doing that, and as really create an opportunity for people across the world where possible to gather and interrogate the major issues of our time. And of course, tonight's issue could scarcely be of greater international importance. Whilst tensions between the West and Russia are, of course, hardly new, both in more recent times, but also over a much longer horizon. Whilst it might be new, the current escalation in tensions nonetheless feels specific and new. And Russia obviously feels it has no choice but to now force this issue of European security to the top of the agenda, and to do so now. And for the West's part, this appears to be the first major foreign policy test for the West and for America since the humiliating withdrawal in Afghanistan, and comes at a time when many insist that old rivalries with Russia should be downplayed in favor of new ones with China. And for both parties, the West and Russia, there are major domestic issues that are shaping this conflict and giving it a new impetus, whether that be the question of energy, whether it's inter-European rivalries, whether it's domestic issues such as Joe Biden's struggling approval ratings or Boris Johnson's parties and the rest of it. That's just for the West. And then, of course, for Russia, the height of the pandemic, economic sluggishness, and the much debated question of what happens after Putin. So there's much to discuss and much to unravel. And thankfully tonight, we couldn't have two better speakers that would help us get to grips with this. So I'll introduce them briefly in the order in which they will speak. First, we have Professor Frank Furedi. Frank is a sociologist and commentator, having been professor of sociology for many years. He's the author of a huge range of books, some from many years ago, including The Soviet Union Demystified, and more recently, a one called 100 Years of Identity Crisis, Culture War Over Socialization. He's also a frequent and prolific commentator on radio, TV, and in print. So I'm delighted to have Frank with us. And then we'll hear from Mary Dejevsky. Mary is an international affairs correspondent for The Independent, having previously been their foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, and Washington. She's written about the collapse of communism from inside Moscow and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. She's written about the Iraq War and is really a key authority on Russian politics and diplomacy between Russia and the West. And her articles, it must be said, are among the few in the UK press that even attempt to portray a balanced view of Russian motivations and indeed Eastern European politics more broadly. So we'll hear from them for 5-6 minutes or so each by way of introduction. I might follow up with a question, but then the aim, as with all Academy of Ideas events, is really to get out to the audience as soon as possible, hear your questions and comments, and really try and make this a genuine public discussion. Now, one quick word before we kick off. We at the Academy of Ideas are committed to holding open, public, and where possible, like tonight, free events. We rely on the generous support from those who share our mission of expanding the boundaries of public debate. And so any contributions, large or small, regular or one-off, are really greatly appreciated. You can support us by heading to academyofideas.org.uk/support, and we'll gratefully receive any donations that you might wish to make. But that is enough from me for now, and enough by way of introduction. I'm excited to kick off this important discussion. So we'll head over to hear from Frank first. So Frank.
I kind of struggle with the current situation because it doesn't make very much geopolitical logic in the way things have played out. And certainly since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, diplomacy has really followed a pattern that doesn't make very much sense for either side. And I remember in 1999, when Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic were formally admitted into NATO, George F. Kennan, who is really the doyen of Soviet policy experts and who developed the whole strategy of containment against the Soviet Union, was very much surprised and alarmed by the way that NATO had expanded into East Europe. And at the time he said, and I quote, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russians' opinion. They have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. That was George F. Kennan, and he was a major architect of the whole Cold War strategy promoted by the United States, and he basically knew what he was talking about. And at the time, all the leading geopolitical players in the State Department took a very similar view. So, for example, James Baker, the old Secretary of State, gave guarantees to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand into the region. And in fact, he made this very famous statement to Gorbachev when he said, not 1 inch eastward. And that was the basic position at that particular stage in time. And of course, today we hear in the press voices that say that the Russians have invented these commitments. They were never made in the first place. But that's not actually true. Because, for example, in 2017, the National Security Archive in Washington declassified all the documents, which demonstrate very, very clearly that these assurances were actually made. So there is a problem here. And the problem is that somehow geopolitical rationality seems to have broken down. And in particular, the United States has lost sight of its own national interest. I think possibly this happened because of its very important unipolar position that it established at the turn of the 21st century. But in a sense, a unipolar situation is not one of stability. It is one that creates an inherently fluid balance of power situation, which I would suggest at the moment is very difficult to achieve. I want to raise four problems that I haven't written about or I haven't discussed, which I think are quite important for the discussion. The first problem is that Western diplomacy is complicated by the fact that it finds it very difficult to elaborate a clear narrative of national and geopolitical interests. I think if you look at the people that work for the State Department or the Foreign Office, they really are inhabited by second-rate placeholders. They're influenced by advocacy organizations, NGOs, who have a disproportionate influence on the kind of policies that are being pursued. Just to give you an example, the Biden administration features dozens and dozens of officials hailing from the Center for American Progress, which is an American think tank, an influential one, set up by John Podesta, who used to be very close to the Clinton administration, and with George Soros's generous contribution. And if you look at the relationship between the Center for American Progress and the State Department, you'll find that they have provided dozens and dozens and dozens of people into very important positions. in the State Department. And the people that have got these jobs are not fully trained diplomats. They're not people that have come through the ranks, who speak foreign languages and really grasp geopolitical realities. They're people who actually do not understand what is going on in Russia or what is going on in very large parts of Europe. They have a very distorted view of external reality. And yet they're the people that are in charge of the foreign policy. And I think if you look at Britain and the role of various NGOs, look at the people that are running the Foreign Office, it is actually quite shocking how badly they compare with the people that ran the Foreign Office 30, 40, 50 years ago. First problem. The second problem is that the West has gained considerable moral authority as the leader of the free world. And during the Cold War, that authority that came with being associated with the free world was very much very important in providing a degree of coherence and clarity to what the West was really all about. Now, the ideological resources that underpin the free world have clearly become exhausted in recent decades. And therefore, what you will find is that although Western societies are meant to be united in NATO and various other bodies, this unity is not really underwritten by any clarity about what it is that binds these societies together. Now, what America has tried to do, what the Department of State has tried to do, is to try to universalize what it sees as its post-liberal values. And in particular, if you look at the American State Department, they try to universalize prevailing cultural norms associated with identity politics, particularly in relation to gender, but also to LGBTQ ideology and various assorted issues to do with inclusion and diversity. We saw that these values didn't go down all that well in Afghanistan. And I think in general, you'll find that in most societies, the attempt to universalize the outlook of the operators in the State Department is likely to come up short. It's not going to provide anything like the alternative that the free world ideology had in a previous era. And yet, despite that, America seems to be determined to impose its moral values on the rest of the world. There's a kind of silly arrogance that seems to be at work here, where there's a kind of sensibility that we are aware America knows what needs to be done and will educate the rest of the world into these values that we've cobbled together in recent decades. Problem three, the divisions in the West are really quite substantial. They're very rarely discussed openly, but there's a lot of evidence that there is a lot of difficulties here. Europe has been more or less isolated from the American-Russia interaction. Europe is not really meant to be in charge anymore of its own security arrangements. So, for example, when Biden sent the 3,000 troops into the area, it didn't do it through Europe. It didn't even do it through NATO. It just merely sent unilaterally these kind of troops over there. And it seems to me that what you have is a complicated situation where divisions of interests, conflicts of interest between France and Germany, between Poland and Germany, between various different players, on the one hand, are paralleled by the growing coming together of an informal Sino-Russian alliance, which I think is quite significant because although there is no long-term strategic basis for China and Russia to collaborate, they have a lot of conflicts of their own, regional ones. Nevertheless, in the present context, they are essentially decided that they're going to watch each other's back, which has got very important implications because it means that the use of the economic weapon, the use of sanctions, and other tools by America in particular are likely to be far less effective than they were in the aftermath of the Crimea affair or previously. I think it is very much the case that, for example, excuse me, China is providing a lot of leverage for Russia to use, and there's even talk that Russia is going to build a new pipeline, energy pipeline, towards China, and avoid having to deal with all the flack that the building of Nord Stream 2 poses in the European kind of context. So we have this situation where, in a sense, a new alliance has been created, almost as if by pushing them into each other's hands by the silliness of Western geopolitics. Problem 4, nobody wants a war. I don't think the Russians want a war. Very clearly, they're not interested in invading the Ukraine, and they're not interested in starting a major global war with America or anybody else. Neither does the United States. They're not in a position to get involved in a serious military conflict. But the trouble is that when you have an unsettled balance of power, and when geopolitics are handled by diplomatically illiterate operatives, anything can happen. I want to end by saying that perhaps it would be useful for people who are listening to reread E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis. It's a very interesting book, and particularly what's interesting about the book, this is really about the period between 1919 and 1939, is that it is above all a critique of the utopian vision of liberal idealists like President Wilson in the United States, who messed things up by having this kind of incoherent geopolitical view of the world. And I think that critique of the utopian idealists, the Wilsonites, can readily be applied to the cosmopolitan sensibility influencing Western diplomacy. I think that more than a dose of sensible geopolitical realism is needed to restore diplomacy, a kind of diplomacy that's more attuned to both national and global interests. That will eventually happen. But for it to happen, the governments of Western societies need somehow to stop listening to Amnesty International, stop listening to the dozens of NGOs that are almost interchangeable with the people working in their offices, and start to begin to ask the question, what is rationally interest of their own nation? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank. That was a very helpful and thorough overview. So I'll just head straight over to Mary, and we'll hear from you, and then I think we'll probably be going out to the audience pretty soon. So, Mary.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. And I was actually going to say something about all the downsides of not appearing at events in person, but the upside over the last 2 years has been the internationalization of so many meetings, just the much wider participation than the sort of narrow circles that often you find in London or when you travel. So I think that is a real upside. So I'm very keen on these sort of events. I'd also like to say, just really as a sort of preface, that probably some people, maybe quite a few people in the audience, tend to think of me as taking, let's say, a more favorable view of Russia than a lot of people who talk about these subjects. But I want to make something clear, which is that I think there's at the moment there's a very negative tendency which says that if you try to understand how things look from Russia, then you're basically anti-Ukrainian. You don't support independence or sovereignty for Ukraine. You take a view that it should be subordinate, that what happened in 1991 should be reversed. And I do not take that view. I try to look at how things seem from Moscow, but I'm also very much in favor of an independent Ukraine. I'm a huge enthusiast for it. I love going to Ukraine. It's incredibly interesting, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. It's taken a different path from Russia. It's a very varied country. It's very accessible. You can have a great time in Ukraine. It's easy to get around. Just the atmosphere, at least I was last there in October, and I hadn't been obviously for 18 months through the pandemic. But I find it just a very, very interesting and in many ways an admirable place to be. And I also think that the current president has suffered, Volodymyr Zelensky has suffered in a way because his election was totally unpredicted by many of the people that Frank was talking about in rather disparaging terms in places like the Foreign Office and the State Department. And they've really, until very recently, and maybe even now, taken quite what I feel has been quite a patronizing view of Zelensky. I watched him give a 90-minute press conference last Friday, where he was talking about all the issues that are currently in play. And to my mind, he has emerged as one of the calmest, most responsible leaders throughout this crisis. And I think it's high time that the West in particular stopped patronizing Zelensky and started treating him as a fully paid up national leader with the genuine national interest of Ukraine at the heart of everything that he does and says. So just a small plug there for Ukraine and President Zelensky. To get back to what I was, to my prepared remarks, the subject for tonight has been cast in a very wide terms as Russia and the West. So something more than just the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I think that's right, because I tend to look at the Russia-Western standoff over Ukraine that we've been watching over the last few weeks as a symptom of the much wider problems that have existed for a very long time between Russia and the West. They're problems that go back at least 15 years, and you could argue that they go back as far as the collapse of the Soviet Union. Looking at the long term, the big picture is Russia's demand, you could say its need, if you look at it as seen from Moscow, for new security arrangements for Europe, which would include Russia rather than drawing a new Cold War line further east than it used to be. Currently, Russia sees, and I think it's not wrong to see, something similar to a Berlin Wall type of East-West bloc type of border now existing between Russia and the West. All the countries that used to be in the Soviet bloc, pretty much, they're now in part of either in the EU or in NATO or both. And that's how Russia looks at it. The new East-West border is right up against its own frontiers. Dmitry Medvedev tried to initiate some sort of talks about a new security order for Europe when he was briefly president between 2008 and 2012. That's when Putin sort of stepped back, according to the constitution, was prime minister, and everybody referred to the pair of them as the tandem in charge of Russia. And it looks as though Putin is trying something similar again. But I think it's taken on a new sense of urgency, because it seems to me that he's looking at it as though it's really just a matter of time before Ukraine joins NATO. Putin had this rather neat expression saying either it's Ukraine in NATO or it might be NATO in Ukraine. And it's really NATO's expansion, whatever form it takes, that lies at the heart of this. And I absolutely agree with Frank and with the quotation that he read from Kennan, that that the expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders is a colossal mistake. And it's something really that's poisoned the whole atmosphere of the last 25 years. And whether you believe that the West broke a promise or not, I almost think it doesn't matter, because it's the perception that counts, and Moscow genuinely believes that a promise was given and a promise was broken. And I think that the documents that we've seen coming out over the last 3 years from Washington do actually support Russia's view. Second point I'd like to make is that is the start of the latest crisis. It's usually traced to American intelligence reports that were leaked to journalists in December about Russian troops massing near the Ukrainian border, and the description of an invasion as imminent. In some ways, this was a replay of troop movements in Russia back in April, when they'd basically come to nothing and they'd sort of dissolved all over the place. And it's a question really of how close they were to the Ukrainian border at all. Some of them seem to have been at least 200, 300 miles away in their barracks. This time, though, rather in contrast to what happened in April, was that Washington started to sound some very loud alarms, and London followed. And I mean, as I see what's been happening over the last month, in some ways, the whole crisis has been led, it's been driven by these two English-speaking governments. And then it's been amplified by the English-speaking media. Elsewhere in continental Europe, in France and Germany, both the leaders and the media, it seems to me, have been rather more cautious and more circumspect. Third point I'd like to make is about the Russian side of this. And I think it's hard to say which is chicken and which is the egg as far as Russia is concerned. Russia presented two documents in December via its foreign ministry. They came almost out of the blue. I don't think anybody was expecting them. And Russia called them draft treaties on European security. And it presented one to the Americans and one to NATO. And some people, both commentators and people in both in NATO and in Washington, saw those documents, saw those draft treaties as they were presented by Moscow, as an ultimatum, and they took very much against them. That's not how I saw them. I saw them, as I think quite a lot of other people saw them, as really as an opening position, as an opening gambit, in the hope that there might be some bargaining that would follow. Now, some people see the troop build-up on Ukraine's borders, and I think it's true to say there has been a troop build-up, though how malevolent its intentions really are and how big it actually is, I think are both worth challenging. I'm not sure that we've quite heard the whole truth about that. But some see that troop build-up as what might be called coercive diplomacy, as a sort of giving those documents a push, illustrating, showing that that Russia is backing its demands or its opening position with a degree of armed strength. But as I say, I don't see them as an ultimatum. I see the proposals as an attempt to attract Western attention and to try to get some talking going, whereas before there wasn't really any talking at all. So from Russia's point of view, you could also say that the combination of the two documents and the troops on the border has actually been highly effective. The United States and NATO were back at the negotiating table within a couple of weeks, which you have to say is quite effective diplomacy on Russia's part. But I think there's a downside to it, which is, in a way, it's unfortunate, but also a bit of a sad commentary on the state of Western Russian relations. Because in some ways it reminds me a bit of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who was sort of firing missiles into the Sea of Japan a few years ago, trying desperately to get American attention or even international attention at all. And nobody would take him seriously. Obama rebuffed all his overtures. And it wasn't until you got Trump, who seemed to understand what Kim was really wanting, and gave him that summit, that high-profile summit meeting, that things started to calm down. So I think, attention-seeking is maybe behind some of what Russia is about at the moment, and I think that's it partly reflects maybe Russia's weakness, but it also reflects the extent to which it's felt frozen out of mainstream diplomacy. And, that's not a good position for Russia to be in, but it's also not a good attitude for the West to take, because Russia is a big country, it's a powerful country, it's a nuclear country. It may have been weak for 20 out of the last 30 years, but it's now gaining in strength, and it's getting itself a bit of a multilateral following in what Russia likes to call Eurasia. So I think Russia needs to be taken seriously to that extent. But as a fourth point, I'd just like to offer you maybe a different interpretation of the Russian troop buildup, as well as attention seeking, and as well as maybe a bit of coercive diplomacy to plug its European security documents. I don't think you should rule out that Russia feels genuinely threatened by the approach of a bigger, richer, more high-tech armed alliance approaching its borders, and that the purpose of the troop movements and the strategy documents are actually that they represent a defensive position on Russia's side, not an aggressive, expansionist or assertive position. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, what could Russia possibly got to be afraid of in NATO? NATO is a purely defensive alliance. Some people say, well, and the defense secretary said so about 2 weeks ago, that it was when Russia complains, as it sometimes does, about encirclement, that the NATO countries up against Russia's borders currently account for only 16% of Russia's borders. But I would say to that, well, yes, but what 16%? It's a very important 16%, Russia's borders with Europe as it sees it. And to Russia, things look quite different from how they look to the West. It doesn't seem to me that if you take this view of Russia taking a defensive rather than offensive position, doesn't mean that the situation currently is any less dangerous. The misperceptions and jumpiness on either side can lead to mistakes, and mistakes can lead to very, very bad situations. But it does mean that instead of threatening Russia with reprisals, the West should be trying to make it feel less threatened and more secure. And this, of course, is the perennial argument. Does Russia feel threatened, or is it an aggressive expansionist power that has to be stopped? I can go into more details and examples of why I think it does feel threatened and how we've got Russia dangerously wrong. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mary. I wanted to let you both run on, because obviously there's so much to cover and so much to get an overview of. Now, look, there's, as I said earlier, I think really we should get out to the audience as quickly as possible. So if anybody's got any questions, comments, we'll take questions and comments in a kind of group. So I'll take several at a time. There's of course much we could cover, but feel free to pick up the speakers on anything they've said or anything they haven't said, including maybe the possibility of a more kind of optimistic resolution to the current crisis. So I'll just take people in the order that they put their hands up. So first, Kerry Dingle.
Hi, thanks very much for organising this, and to Mary and Frank for their great insights. I've just got a few questions. Firstly, I just wonder what you both see as different really to, say, Blair using Iraq to boost a domestic moral authority, or Cameron in Libya, and Boris now in Britain. Frank's and Mary have sort of outlined the situation, and a lot's changed, but it does seem to be very much the same moral grandstanding. So I wonder if you feel it's very different or more dangerous or more or less likely to end in conflagration. Mary, I wondered if you can tell us, I mean, we've read in the press that Ukrainians would like the West to stop the fear-mongering, and that they're not polls show that they don't believe Russia is about to invade. But I wonder what do Russians on the ground, is it a similar thing? You know, are they nervous? Are they fearful? I know you said Russia as governmentally feels threatened, but I wonder what Russians are thinking. Frank, I wondered if, well, maybe you'd know and tell us about, you know, we know that Putin and Orban have been in conversation. What's Hungary's relationship? Because we don't seem to have heard a lot of what's happened there. And then on the US, if either of you are able to clarify things, to what extent has Russia bashing and the vilification as the great evil of Russia, is that on a par with China bashing, or has it gone to new heights? Do you know what I mean? Because it seems that the last few years it's been China bashing, and now it's Russia bashing. And just lastly, I am shocked, I must say, that I can't, and I've flipped through many channels, perhaps RT aside, every morning, the news feels like one big lie in that this invasion is about to happen. I haven't for a long time, probably since the Balkans, felt that every day was one big lie in the news, because there is no questioning going on in terms of what's really happening. And I wondered if you'd got any thoughts on that.
Carrie, a good overview of the huge amount of ground that we really need to cover in this discussion. So next up is Kevin Moore.
I'm just going to pick up on what Frank said right at the very start. He speaks of confusion at current events. Now, I'm ex-military. You can kind of gather that from the Royal Signals Post at the back of the wall. Is Russia in actual position to invade Ukraine? Force ratio says not a chance. It would be skirmish, bloody, deadly, horrible, but skirmish. They wouldn't be able to invade with the supposed 125,000 they've got on the border. In response to what Mary said about taking views, and you know, you could be with Russia and then you're against Ukraine, or vice versa. Now, I've actually spoken to members from both countries on both sides, and personally, I'm taking the view that of all sides in this, so I'm not drawing any personal conclusions as yet, because the feeling I'm getting from the Russian side is they haven't got a clue what's going on, especially of the age generation between 20 and 40. They're scratching their heads going, what? Why are we there? And yet there's the other side of, for me, I'm actually in agreement with what was said about the escalation of whether it's going to be offensive, defensive, especially with the papers being released, of where does Russia draw the line. But the question for me is, what is Russia's end goal? What do they want to happen? I mean, there's been a couple of suggestions. I mean, please God, no, a Berlin-style wall. I mean, nobody wants to see one of them again. And the question, has NATO gone too far? I think the answer to that is clearly yes, especially with those two documents that have been released. So the question for me is, how can we de-escalate this situation? Because I think Frank's right in regards to, let's just say our diplomats are not what they were of, say, 30, 40 years ago. I don't think they have the same, I'm going to use the words moral fibre today of what they did then. So I want to say thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. So we'll take two more, and then we'll get Frank and Mary back. So there's already a lot to unpack. But so Phil Hammond.
Thanks. It's mainly for Frank. Frank, you suggested that a sort of pursuit of an articulation and pursuit of national interest would be a kind of a better way to go in foreign policy than the current kind of post-liberal cosmopolitanism. But could you not say that at least some of the intra-Western divisions derive from attempts to assert a kind of national interest? I'm thinking particularly of the attitude of European powers vis-a-vis the US in relation not just to Ukraine, but also other kind of policy questions in Eastern Europe. Often the EU as a body or individual leading EU states like Germany or France seem to want to assert a kind of national independent policy that goes against what the US is saying. And by the same token, perhaps I mean, I take your point that the kind of influence of civil society actors and NGOs and so on is not helpful. But maybe the foreign policy, inexperienced foreign policy establishments are buying into that stuff because there is no other available political framework through which to try and articulate a kind of common cause that will pull rival Western powers to come along and join in with their favoured policies. That's it.
Thanks, Phil. So take Giovanna and then we'll get our speakers back.
So, on what has been said tonight, I tend to agree with Mary in the sense that Russia has a legitimate concern about the expansion of NATO, because remember, the United States has a moral doctrine which will never allow any forces or naval forces to come closer to the United States. So that is realist geopolitics. So from that perspective of geopolitics, of realist politics, Russia has a legitimate concern about the expansion of NATO, because when we're talking about NATO, especially since the end of the Cold War, we're talking about a military alliance who control all the rapid reaction forces in Europe and also in the United States, nuclear weapons, and all the missiles positioning in Europe. So we're talking about something very, very important. And Russia has always had a concern. Remember, 2008, the Georgia war was very similar to a situation. When I see what's happening now, I've always had in my mind Georgia, 2008, when after the Bucharest NATO summit, and NATO made explicit that they would expand Bulgaria and other countries, also Georgia and also Ukraine. There was a section of the US establishment who, like in Ukraine right now, so they have special forces which were supporting the government and they were instigating, there was a military presence. And Russia stationed a massive amount of troops at the border, and it did a blitzkrieg, a blitz war, which lasted 10 days, where they went in, they bombed, and they just made sure that the country was partitioned into two. In fact, Georgia was partitioned. So when I look at the events right now, I think, there is a very dangerous situation, because what happened in Georgia could happen again, because Russia feels threatened. And they could be willing, on one hand, I understand what Mary says, that there are all these big issues about security issues and things like that, and maybe Russia see that the US is weak because it just withdrew from Afghanistan, et cetera, but the fact that they're positioned the forces, they could have a plan also to split the country into two, because the country is not united. We got to remember what happened during the war. The country is in two parts, Russian speaking and Ukrainian. It's already split. So I just wonder if you could say something more about that. Great. In relation to what happened in Georgia. Yeah.
Thank you, Giovanna. Very, very helpful. No, a helpful bit of context. So I'll head over to Frank and Mary, and we'll get some quick responses. Frank first.
Yeah, I don't think there's any comparison between the way domestic politics works in relation to Iraq or even to Libya, because Russia is not a small country like Iraq and Libya. There's never any issue about invading Russia itself, but also because something very disturbing has happened since that time, which is that Russia has become implicated by various security players in Britain and the United States in their domestic politics. So just think of the number of times Russia has been criticized for interfering in the election of France, interfering in the election of Trump. Russia is responsible for Brexit. I mean, all the ways in which there's been a kind of domestic internalization of the Russian threat What you also have, and that's very interesting, we haven't discussed until now, are big divisions about it, because sections of the right-wing Republican Party is pro-Russian, whilst the Democrats and the Republicans, the more centrist Republicans, are anti-Russian in terms of their outlook at the moment. And you have very similar divisions in many, many parts of Europe. So the situation is really very different than it was in the past. And that indicates to us that it's almost like a new situation, because you have both China and Russia being active economic players within these societies, rather than just being out there. Russia and China, America, the West, are completely interlocked in the global economy, and therefore to actually separate that in terms of a war and anything of that sort will have very major implications for everybody concerned. Somebody asked a question about Putin and Orban. It's a very interesting question, because although Mary is right, Ukraine is a very nice place to go to. If you go to, very cheap, you go to Lviv and all these other places. And although the government of the Ukraine is relatively more enlightened than the previous ones, they have made a few mistakes. One of the mistakes they made is in terms of their minority policy. For example, a lot of Hungarians feel aggrieved that Hungarian education is being abolished. So Hungarian schools are being forced to teach in Ukrainian rather than in Hungarian. And it does create a certain amount of tension. But by and large, Hungary is one of those countries that has become very reliant on Russia strategically in terms of oil and energy. And therefore, a certain modus vivendi has been established, which I think is quite interesting, because Hungary has always been almost viscerally anti-Russian, given the history of being invaded by Russia on more than 2 occasions in the recent era. So there is a kind of weirdness that goes on in relation to these three. I think that just a final point on European national interests. Well, European national interests may well be asserted formally, but in a very feeble and a weak kind of a way. So you often have a situation where people are hiding behind the European Union, where Germany tries to almost kind of be a neutral player, but by being a neutral player, what it indicates is that it wants to maintain the status quo in terms of cultivating its relationship with Russia. France would like to be the main interlocutor with Russia in Europe. So that's the natural alliance. The French-Russian alliance is a natural alliance that it sees in terms of history. And as far as Britain is concerned, I don't think Britain is very clear what it's trying to do. It's trying to forge an alliance with Poland and some of the local players against Russia. But I think what is very sad is that the 2 English-speaking countries are the ones that are least able to have a rational assessment of what the situation is at the moment. And I don't think what Johnson is doing is entirely influenced by domestic policy concerns and domestic pressures, a way of avoiding having to account for his behavior. I think that there is a genuine sort of confusion and verging on hostility towards Putin, which is partially culturally driven. I think one of the things that hasn't been discussed enough is that the people in the Foreign Office or in the State Department are the cultural opposite to the kind of values that the Russian government stands for. And I think one of the issues that hasn't really been brought out is that underneath or behind these geopolitical conflicts that we've been discussing is also a kind of embryonic global culture war, which has got to do with values, which has been recognized by people all over the world as being really quite important, but which, precisely because it's about culture, can acquire a very dangerous form once things begin to explode a little bit.
Thanks, Frank. Mary, some thoughts?
Oh yes, so many questions, so many fantastic questions. I'm going to start from the last one. It was about spheres of influence in the split in Ukraine. I absolutely agree on spheres of influence. For some reason, the United States in particular took an official position that spheres of influence were something very, very bad. And if Russia wanted a sphere of influence, that was really even worse. And I think to a lot of people, not just me, this seems to be incredibly hypocritical because, I mean, Giovanna referred to the Monroe Doctrine, but it's not just that, but you look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you look to the attempt that the United States had to do a bit of regime change in Venezuela, then America does interfere colossally in its backyard if it sees that there are forces that it thinks are hostile to the United States that are growing in influence. So the idea that that's sort of okay for the United States, but it's not okay for Russia, I think really, you know, there needs to be a bit more honesty about this. On the question of the split in Ukraine, yes, I would say certainly for a very long time, Ukraine was split really down the middle, practically through Kiev, as to whether it looked east or west and whether it wanted to look east or west in the future. Now, my experience of going to Ukraine over the last 10 years or so has been that that line between looking west and looking east has moved to the east, so that you've got much more of Ukraine looking to the west than you have looking to the east. And I think to some extent, the war in the east, which is often referred to as being by separatists, it's not really by separatists. I think there's much more of an analogy with Northern Ireland. It's more that there is there's a dispute in which two sides have taken to arms between different cultures, different cultural directions, and that the now much smaller group of Ukrainians who look to the east rather than looking to the west or looking to the center of Ukraine, that they feel very beleaguered and they want their interests defended. But I think that the fact that they did take to arms, the fact that they are receiving support of some kind, though I think not nearly as much as the West claims from Russia, illustrates, in fact, that the bulk of Ukraine is actually more united than it was. I also think that the results of the last election, of the presidential election, when Zelensky won, he won this colossal landslide right across Ukraine, which there was almost no division between east, west, and center, and there was only one part of a very small part, which was really the constituency and the fiefdom of the former president, who Zelensky defeated, Petro Poroshenko. It was only his home area that actually voted against Zelensky at the last presidential election. And I think in some ways, Russia, by being so hostile to Ukraine in recent years, has actually pushed its policies have been counterproductive in that it's alienated a lot of Ukrainians and made them think that maybe their future is in looking more to the west than to the east. So I think that's when Russia comes to look at its policies towards Ukraine in the fullness of time, it may see how counterproductive that's been. I think I'll address Kerry's point about the big lie. I mean, I have to say, I did not understand for at least 3 weeks. I had the same thing. I was listening to the radio every morning. I was watching television, and it seemed to me that it was a driven propaganda orchestration telling us that we were being threatened by Russia and Russia was about to invade, and there was no other view. And you know, I tweet quite enthusiastically, but I tweeted 1,000,000 times more and 1,000,000 times more enthusiastically than I had done before, because I felt that there was this consensus that was being built, and there was this sort of attempt to dominate public opinion, and there was no opposition to this being heard. And so I was putting out all these tweets, and I think Maybe I would say that in the last 10 days, only the last 10 days, the BBC at least has started maybe partly to understand that it was giving a really uncontested and, to my mind, very propagandistic version of what was happening. And two things happened to that. One of them was that it started to make much greater use of Steve Rosenberg, their correspondent in Moscow, who seems to me to take quite a moderate and realistic view, and who was giving at least presenting a view of how it looked from Moscow. And the other thing was that some British correspondents were going to Kiev. And that addresses another point, which suddenly all the correspondents who got to Kiev said, oh my goodness, this is not what we expected. We expected to find Ukraine preparing for war. What we're finding instead is that Kiev and most of Ukraine is entirely calm and saying, don't get too overwrought about it. And Zelensky himself has been on record several times as saying, we're keeping calm here. And we actually don't appreciate the extent to which the Americans and the British have been, in their view, hyping this threat, which in their view has been counterproductive and has been incredibly dangerous. And that was one of the things that Zelensky said at his press conference last week. He said, please calm down the rhetoric. And I think to an extent we have seen just over the last weekend really how the rhetoric has calmed down. The Americans have actually made a point of saying they're dropping the word imminent because it's been misinterpreted. And there's been a lot more talking going on both in public and behind the scenes. So, okay, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mary. So yeah, more questions. Also, to everyone in the audience, of course, feel free to ask more questions of clarification as well as making points. So we've got obviously some great experts here, and we can maybe shed a bit more light. So if there's something you don't understand, feel free to ask that question as well as making points or criticisms and all the rest of it. So first, over to Alex.
I feel on extremely shaky ground with this question. So if you want to ignore me, please do, of course. Everything other than the articles written by Mary and Frank recently, everything that I've read, whether it's for the UK press or America, has left me absolutely bamboozled, in the sense that it seems that very few people know why this is happening or can even pitch a decent reason why it's such a big issue and why Western countries need to get involved. So anything from quoting senior military advisors in America who in the one moment will say it's an existential threat, 2 paragraphs later will say, it's never going to happen. So my reading of the situation leaves me in a place where I just think, if they don't know what's going on, how am I supposed to? So my question, which is, as I say, is on shaky ground, Frank kind of touched on it and made me think that maybe I shouldn't ask, but it's like a niche I need to get scratched, and that is there no sense whatsoever that all the Russia baiting at the moment, not to downplay the reality of the situation, but the Russia baiting that's going on, is there no sense that it's a kind of proxy propaganda war about China, or am I just losing it?
Thanks, Alex. So next up, Manley, I think.
Hi, yes, Martin. Question really, as Frank spoke about, at some point there'll be a realignment where Western diplomacy can start to articulate a national interest, a more rational approach. And I wonder where that will come from, because the approach of the Europeans and the US is so incoherent and defensive. So when Biden talks about the dispatching 3,000 troops to Poland, Germany, and to Romania, that's nothing. And they first say that they won't be going to the Ukraine. So it's almost like each announcement is very, very defensive. They kind of stress what they're not going to do. as well as moving some boards around, some players around. But my question is, how do you see that the West and then under the US will there be a realignment of them asserting national interests? Are they capable of doing that? Because I agree with Mary that I think Russia is attention seeking in an attempt to be taken seriously in its own sphere of influence between NATO and itself. And with the US not taking it seriously, then it will go more and more towards China, who actually does take it seriously. And in moving forward, China has a way in the East of articulating a national interest, their interest, in a very confident way, whereas the West is very incoherent. So what will bring that realignment? Last point briefly is Trump tried crudely to assert a national interest for America towards Russia and to other places in terms of sanctions, relationships. It didn't really work. So what is the basis for a more rational realignment of Western diplomacy?
Thanks a lot. Very helpful. On to Sabina.
Yeah, just a little observation from this country, which is Germany. And I'm actually not quite sure, Mary, that Germany and the German press has been so very different. So we've had a lot of warmongering on this side here too. And one thing which I find just really weird is the kind of fixation on the person of Putin. So it's almost like, everything. It's not Russia. People are not saying it's not Russia. It's Putin. Putin is described as a devil. So I've heard a serious radio commentator actually referring to him as a devil, almost like the kind of, reimagining of a dark empire, as if we're kind of in a game of war or whatever. It's sort of like almost like as if Putin was gone, maybe things might be better. And that kind of that links into the cultural war point which Frank made, because then you have the other side. You have for quite some years now, the German right, people from Pegida or even from the AfD being actually Putin fans, where you see people going on demonstration holding up Putin posters. So it all seems really, really messy to me. I just wanted to kind of ask how we could make sense of that, because it seems very, very infantile. And the last question I have is, or the second question I have is, how can we get out of this? And I've been reading some articles here arguing that the only country which could help us get out of this whole thing is Ukraine itself. So Ukraine saying, actually, we don't want to be members of NATO. We've changed our mind because we know that we're just a battlefield of complete diverse interests and we can never win. So my question is there a chance of that happening? And why doesn't Ukraine actually do that? Why doesn't Zelensky say that? Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. A great last question about the agency of Ukraine in this. Roger, and then we'll come back to Mary and Frank.
My goodness, I think Putin would be perfectly happy if to achieve what he wants to achieve by diplomatic means. I think he would be very happy to just for the Minsk II agreement to sort of go forward, which wasn't very sort of helpful for Ukraine. What is really worrying me at the moment is that they, rather than incompetence on the American side, is they actually are trying to sort of provoke a proxy war, and so that Putin, that there's an acceptance that he'll probably get what he wants, but they want it to be at a cost, and that cost being a much reduced military capacity, thanks to the Ukrainians. I'd like to think I'm wrong. I'm sure, but probably a lot of you will tell me as I am. But it does worry me. And the other thing to remember is it wouldn't do the Biden family themselves any harm for a regime change in Ukraine in terms of a different sort of, not so long ago there were special prosecutors looking into Biden activities there. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Okay, so maybe first to Mary and then over to Frank this time around.
Oh yes, so many wonderful questions. The Putin phenomenon. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Putin phenomenon is, I mean, it is just extraordinary. I just actually wrote the latest of however many articles I've written on this subject about why Putin has got this image of being the sort of all-powerful, the Tsar-like figure who's malevolent, who is, as you say, the devil incarnate. You look at the cartoons that there are of Putin. It seems to me that the West is really guilty of having magnified Putin out of all proportion, and that we've now created this, we've created this bogeyman that we've now made ourselves scared of, and that really there's got to be a rethinking about this, because it's not that Putin and Russia are different. If Putin were to be out of power tomorrow, Russia would still be there, and the complexion of Russia, the political complexion of Russia, social complexion of Russia would be identical to how it is today. Putin's concern for national security and things like that is representative of Russians' own concern for that. By getting rid of Putin, you won't improve things on that score. It could actually get worse. So I think really we have to decide to treat Putin as a normal national leader. I mean, in some ways, I think Trump was the person who got the measure of Putin best, because he appreciated that he was a national leader with the national security and national interests of Russia at heart, and he wanted to deal with him on that basis. And almost no other leader has been prepared to do that. But you've got to treat Putin as a normal national leader, not as some sort of superhuman phenomenon, or as the devil incarnate. I think also, I think in connection with that, just going back to the United States, I think maybe there's another way of reading. Somebody said, well, you know, are they trying to provoke a war between Russia and Ukraine to weaken Russia or whatever? I think you could look at it in a completely different light and say that maybe while Russia has been maybe trying to test Biden as president, maybe Biden has at the back of his mind that he actually wants to try and normalize relations with Russia. But he saw what happened to Trump when Trump wanted to do that. And so while trying to start negotiations with Putin on various topics, including security issues in Europe, maybe he has to send a message to his own people to say, look, I'm absolutely as tough on Russia as I can be, and that maybe some of the explanation for that really harsh and completely unrealistic rhetoric that was coming about all the war talk that was coming from Washington and London over the last month, maybe some of that can be explained by Biden trying to, as it were, to square his own anti-Russian people in the Washington establishment. I don't think you could necessarily rule that out. I'd just like to refer to another question. There was one of Kerry's questions that was asked, which was about Russian opinion and Ukrainian opinion. I think we've seen quite a bit recently about, most recently about Ukrainian opinion and being really relatively calm and saying, essentially, we've been at war for the last 8 years, one way or another. And yes, it could get worse, but we're prepared for it. We've trained for this, we're prepared for it. And we don't want anybody from outside making matters worse. I think in Russia, I saw something today that said actually the whole subject of Ukraine has hardly figured in Russian news broadcasts over the last few days, which suggests that it may be calming down from Russia's side as well. But there have been opinion polls done on Russian views about going to war at all and going to war with Ukraine. And public opinion in Russia is very hostile to the idea. It doesn't want to go to war with anybody. Why would it? There's enough people in Russia today who remember the Russian defeat and retreat from Afghanistan, which was one of the factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many people had friends, relatives, the children of relatives who fought in that war, people who didn't come back. That's the most recent memory for most Russians of a war fought by Russia. There's the war, 2 wars fought in Chechnya. Russians don't want to fight, and particularly I would say that they don't want to fight Ukrainians. I mean, the intermingling of Russians and Ukrainians, one of the whole problems with the Ukrainian border is that it was never really properly demarcated in the Soviet era. People crossed to and fro without any say so. That people worked on the other side of the border, into marriage, relatives live on either side of the border. In that respect, it has things in common with Ireland. So demarcating a firm border between Russia and Ukraine, as would happen if peace negotiations actually eventually succeed, that's not something that's going to be universally welcomed. But at the same time, the idea that there would be Russians fighting Ukrainians, that's not welcome on either side of the border.
Thanks, Mary. Frank, some thoughts, and then audience, we'll come out for another quick round of questions. So do raise your hand using the function if you'd like to.
The Putin phenomenon is very, very significant, and it symbolizes the failure of Western diplomacy more than anything, because one of the things that has happened in the last 25, 30 years is that Western diplomacy has had a problem dealing with strong national leaders. It regards national leaders who take the sovereignty and the interest of their nation seriously as somehow, by definition, defective. And if you look at the language that is used about Putin, in a minor way, a very similar language is used, especially in Germany, towards Orban, who's seen as this little devil incarnate, and also towards Erdogan, for very similar reasons. Now, a lot of people in the West don't seem to understand that whatever you think of different strong leaders, however much you don't like them, it's not the job of your government to get rid of them, or it's not the job of your government to target them as individuals. And if you look at the stupidity of American and British foreign policy, I don't know if you noticed it, but whenever they make any announcements of what they're going to do, whenever they're going to impose sanctions, they immediately say, the members of the Russian elite will pay a heavy price. In other words, they personalize it to different so-called rich Russian oligarchs who are going to become punished in the first instance. So the idea becomes that the way you play the diplomatic game, the way you kind of crack down, is by targeting individuals and making them pay an economic price. Because the assumption is that these leaders of Russia are so venal, all they care about is money, that if they understand that their pocket is going to be hit, they're going to roll over and that will be it. And that kind of illusion, that kind of personalized way of running diplomacy represents, I think, a very important statement about just how people think geopolitics works in the 21st century. I think that the way that national interests will be realigned is if and when the present trends continue. And it's likely that if the present trends continue, then you're going to have a much more degree of economic conflict than is the case at the moment. I think we're seeing the unraveling of a globalized world economy. A lot of the tensions that are at play at the moment will be linked to economic rivalries and conflicts. You can already see that being played out on the world stage. And when that becomes even sharper and more defined, I think at that point, governments will have to think about, what it is that they have to defend. How should they begin to reframe their external policies? Because at that point in time, they will realize that national interests are something that you cannot just abandon or not take seriously. You're really going to sit down and work out a way of giving that some kind of definition. And I think that will eventually happen, but we're fairly far away from that. I just want to say one thing about the Ukraine, which is that one of the problems, I mean, that we're kind of confronting with is that Ukraine is actually, despite the unity, the political unity of the Ukraine, is in a relatively weak and fragile economic position. And you literally have millions of people, especially the young, the most educated section of Ukrainian population, all moving westwards, all going to Poland, to Hungary, wherever they can go. In fact, I haven't got the statistics here, but the percentage of the population that has left Ukraine in recent years is phenomenally high, even higher than in Bulgaria and Romania, which until now were the main exporters of people. So not only have you got a large number of migrant, the most important people emigrating in the Ukraine, what you also have is a demographic bust in the Ukraine. In other words, the rate of birth in the Ukraine is, I think, even lower. I'm not really sure than in Russia, where it is already very, very low. And I think all these things are indicators of the fact that within the Ukraine itself, there are some very big problems, which means that the room for maneuver of Ukraine to be genuinely acting with agency is relatively limited at this stage in time. And I think that's something that we should, that point I think we should always remember, because it tells us that one way or the other, the Ukraine does need some kind of external support if it is to flourish as a democracy, and if it is to maintain its national sovereignty, something that I think all of us in this discussion are very much behind.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, so come out, I think, from one last round of questions. Anyone, again, wants to make any points, but also ask any questions, and I'll make sure that we can give our speakers some time to address them in the wrap-up.
Thanks very much. I actually just arrived back in the country from Bulgaria, where it was interesting to talk to people. I was chairing an event with the President and Prime Minister to ask them what their view was. But as a result, I missed Frank's introduction, and I caught most of Mary's. So sorry if I'm asking questions that have been answered already in the introduction. So I wanted to go back to this question that was raised in different ways by various people, which is, what is actually really going on here, and what is Russia's end goal? I mean, I think it's much clearer actually what the West is doing, and maybe it's a bit, and I haven't got completely clear in my mind what Russia's end goal is here. So, and the way I see it is in kind of layers of motivation here for what Russia's doing. So I'd be interested to hear what Mary thinks about this. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to understand that this has happened twice last year with this build-up of Russian forces along the border. So what is really going on there? I think that part of it is that for a very long time now, all channels of communication and diplomacy and dialogue have been shut down, and that was particularly the case. I mean, that's happened really as a result of this increasingly kind of Russophobia that we've seen after the 2016 elections, the Brexit, Trump, and so on, and then obviously after the killings here in Salisbury, everything was shut down, and the only way in which Russia can actually get the attention of the West and actually assert its position in relation to what it perceives to be its interests and what's going on is to do something like this. Now, so what is the aim here? Is it about Ukraine? Is it just about preventing Ukraine's closer integration with NATO? In a way, I think, obviously, Ukraine, this is not really about Ukraine. Obviously, to some extent, it's about Ukraine, but this is not just about Ukraine, because actually, in terms of that goal of preventing Ukraine's integration with the West, that was already achieved, basically. That was done in 2014. and everybody knows that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, and the annexation of Crimea and the creation of this enclave in eastern Ukraine means that, and through the Minsk process, that Russia has this kind of Trojan horse already in Ukraine that will make sure that that never happens. Now, in the process, I agree absolutely with Mary that it's done that at the cost of uniting Ukraine more than it's ever been before in its history, and actually creating some sense, a more kind of coherent sense of nationhood. But Frank is also right that Ukraine is in a very, very weak position, and actually everything that the West is doing is really exposing it and doing nothing to help Ukraine at all. So I don't think it's just about preventing Ukraine's closer integration. I think it is about asserting Russia's position as a great power that cannot be ignored, that has to be involved in negotiations about security in Europe. And 2014 is important because that's the time actually when Russia was first in a position to start reasserting itself after the kind of humiliations of the kind of post-Soviet years. And that's what Putin's been trying to do ever since. And that's really the point here. It's about getting the West to take Russia seriously, to enter into negotiations at the highest levels with the US and other powers, and to actually reestablish those forums and channels of communication. I think Russia does have genuine security concerns. It does take two to tango, and all its red lines have been crossed. It is being encircled. I think one very important thing that actually hasn't been discussed very much is the recent reactivation of a US artillery unit in Mainz-Kastel in Germany, which will have been viewed with great alarm by the Kremlin. And that's a crucial development, as the unit will carry a hypersonic missile, Dark Eagle, which obviously Russia considers to be a threat. So it's about this kind of what it sees as infringement of its sovereignty all the time by NATO. But the final thing that occurred to me, that it's also about Russia's relationship with China. Now, the idea that Russia can really have any kind of genuine alliance with China is a nonsense as far as I can see. Russia will never want to play second fiddle to China. And a big concern of Putin and the Russians is to make sure that they do everything possible to enhance their own security and their position on the international stage, and particularly in their own backyard, where China is increasingly encroaching, which Russia resents very greatly. So I think in all these different ways, these are the motivations of Russia. And unfortunately, as for other powers, this is a very high risk strategy for both sides, and it can have unforeseen consequences as well. Some of which Mary's mentioned already.
Thanks, Joan. Very helpful. I mean, you can actually see the China thing playing out even in Ukraine, where if you go, there's loads of Chinese cars in a way there isn't almost anywhere in Europe, and so that's even playing out even in Ukraine. I wanted to read. Somebody's messaged me asking if I could read out questions to them, so I'll do that. I'll follow up with one of my own, and then we'll get our speakers to sum up. So, somebody's messaged me saying, could they comment on the fact that it's been said that NATO is a marketing strategy for the arms industry, and so is this anti-Russian hysteria a campaign and a kind of justification for US military budgets in an attempt to make NATO countries kind of buy more American arms? I'd like as well just to ask our speakers in the summing up to maybe assess the prospects, even if the kind of longer term trends that you've talked about play out as said, just kind of the shorter term prospects for this series of negotiations. Because it seems to me, at least from the leaked kind of responses of the Americans to those Russian treaties that Mary mentioned, it seems that at least some people in the American establishment are taking a slightly more constructive view with regards to negotiations with Russia. Biden made a lot was made of Biden's kind of position as somebody with genuine foreign policy expertise, and him being a slightly more old-fashioned kind of leader who would be prepared to negotiate with these things, and also is desperate to solve or at least as far as he can be desperate on anything given his overall sluggishness, but seems kind of eager to solve that issue and move on genuinely to the China issue. So I mean, these longer term trends that you both talk about may well play out, but is there some kind of cause for optimism in the near term that these things might get solved in at least in a kind of way that is productive, at least in the kind of short or medium term? But anything else that you guys would like to sum up on? Again, maybe I'll do it the same way. So Mary, can I come to you first?
Oh, how difficult. Let me take the question of Ukraine's economy. I think is very, very important. And one of the things that I think wasn't really appreciated early on in the democracy movements in Ukraine is that Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is a poorer country than Russia. And people generally don't see that because they outside Ukraine and outside Russia, they see Ukraine as it were a bit more European than Russia. And so the assumption is that it's richer than Russia. And it's not. All you have to do is cross this, the border that I was referring to as quite invisible. But it's immediately apparent that Ukraine, except for Kiev, is a poorer country. Now, it's quite its urban areas are very, very livable. You can have a decent standard of living in cities in Ukraine, but the average standard of living, average facilities, and the look of the country, it is a poorer country than Russia, and that needs to be borne in mind. And it was interesting that Zelensky's press conference last week, where he said, on the one hand, stop talking up this war. This is counterproductive. It makes things less secure than they already are. At the same time, he put out a plea saying, one of the reasons we want everybody to keep calm, we don't need a war. Our economy is weak. He was saying that they'd lost all sorts of prospective promises of investment just in the last 10 days. And he said he didn't sort of strike enormous, he was obviously trying to calm things down. But this has been extraordinarily damaging for Ukraine's economy. And I don't think that was what America intended. I don't think it's what Russia intended by having the troops there. But that's been the effect on Ukraine, and potentially that is devastating. About sanctions and Russian oligarchs and Russian money. It's always struck me as, and I saw somebody saying again earlier this week that say what we really need to do is we really need to have sanctions on individuals who are close to Putin, and then they'll go to Putin and they'll say, look, we can't stand for this. You've got to change your policy. That, to my mind, is that is just completely absurd. The idea that there are people close to Putin who are going to say, look, the Brits are making all sorts of restrictions and they're threatening to take my visa and my property away. Now you've got to change your policy. That is not how Putin works. That's not how the Kremlin works. And that's the idea that there are people in that position to influence Putin in that way, I think is just a complete misreading of the situation. I put together what is Russia's endgame, why now, and what are the prospects? I think one of the reasons why now is because Russia was actually getting very worried, first of all, that there were no talks going on. Second of all, that Ukraine was going somehow to be fast-tracked into NATO. And as Joan said, I absolutely agree with her. What's going on at the moment is not only about Ukraine. It's partly about Ukraine, but it's about Ukraine as a sort of symptom of the much bigger processes in Europe, that Russia sees this new border coming up along its borders, which is separating it from the rest of Europe. And I think that's what's at stake there. And why now? Because Russia thinks that it's more urgent than it was, because Ukraine is closer to being absorbed into the Western Bloc. And I think it was about 6 weeks ago, it was before Christmas sometime, I heard Putin, for the first time that I can remember, talking of Ukraine's NATO membership, prospective NATO membership, as being a red line for Russia. I'd never heard him say that before. I may be wrong, but I'd never heard him say that before. And I think that's behind some of what's going on now. Russia's end goal, I think, is new security arrangements for Russia. I think it's worth reading those draft treaty documents to see what Russia's, as it were, what Russia's ideal position is, while recognizing that that's not going to happen. But some of it, I think, may happen. I mean, as you said, I don't think either Russia's response or America's response to those documents has been quite as negative as we've been encouraged to think. That there are talks starting. And there are things like one of the things that Russia wanted quite specifically was disengagement of troops on either side, not just on either side of the Ukrainian border, but on either side, as it were, of the NATO border and the Russia border. And that would, of course, be restrictions on deployments of troops and weapons, which Russia would have to observe as well. This would be bilateral. So I think there is something in there for the Western side as well as for Russia, and that the prospects of reaching some sort of agreement can't be written off, which is where I think things are going at the moment. And also, I mean, my assessment, and I may be completely wrong about this, but my assessment is that the big crisis point in what we've been talking about, the Ukraine crisis over the last few weeks, was actually reached in about the middle of last week. And on Thursday of last week, we saw Putin go to St. Petersburg and pay his respects for the 78th anniversary of the end of the siege of Leningrad. And Putin, as a St. Petersburger, a Leningrader, he goes there every year for that ceremony, for that commemoration. But I think the prominence that it was given and Putin's demeanor on those sort of occasions, that said to me that Russia was trying to send a signal that it did not want war. Whatever was going on, it did not want war. On the Thursday, well, on the Friday, we saw a succession of press briefings and meetings. We had the Secretary General of NATO. We had the meeting between Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in Geneva. And we had the long press conference that I've referred to several times by Zelensky in Kiev. And it seemed to me that everybody basically was putting their position, was trying to clarify their position for the benefit of other parties in public without actually talking to them in direct. And it seemed to me that after that, we were looking at a rather different situation and a different atmosphere. So I hope I'm right.
Thanks a lot, Mary, and thanks for your comments throughout. Okay, Frank, over to you for the last one.
I don't know what the end game of Russia is, but the one thing that I think is very important for the Kremlin is to stabilize its role as a regional power and to gain international recognition for that. I think paradoxically, Russian diplomacy has been much more successful in other parts of the world than in the regions around Russia. So, Russia's got a problem with Kazakhstan. Russia's got problems with some of the instability in some of the Caucasian areas. There's also the problem in Belarus, which are very near its borders, and of course the Ukraine. Whereas it's done really well in Syria, it's done much better in the Middle East, and it's done quite well in Africa in terms of establishing certain kind of bridgeheads and points of contact. So, in a sense, for Russia, the near Russia area and stabilizing that is much more important than anything else. I don't think there will be a war, but I'm not that sure that things are as settled as we hope. So, for example, just I think it was today or yesterday, we had another one of these American intelligence reports that claimed that the Russians are organizing sort of some kind of an insidious operation to provoke a war within the Ukraine. And they seem to be continually putting out these intelligence reports that purport to show what Russia is planning next week or the week after that. So that kind of provocation still exists. I think the problem, as I see it, some of the points that haven't been mentioned is best answered if you can find a solution to the question of who benefits from the crisis at the moment. And I don't see either Russia or America or Britain or the West actually benefiting from this. Nobody's got an interest in escalating these tensions and conflicts. I think one of the problems that we have is that we also have a media that we haven't discussed that seems to be a law unto itself, that is dead set on provoking greater and greater Russian phobia within Western societies. And that's something that we shouldn't ignore, or its significance shouldn't be underestimated. But what I'm really worried about, the point I come back to time and time again, is when you have the intertwining of domestic politics with external relations, as you have in the United States, where Russia is seen and discussed within the domestic political domain as a player, either as an opponent or as a supporter, you do fall into a very big problem, because it's very difficult to unravel the domestic calculations that different party operators make in the United States from what you do outside of that. And the thing that I'm most worried about is that given the ascendancy of a moralizing impulse within Western diplomacy, I see that as a very dangerous development, because when you moralize geopolitics, that distracts people from pursuing their real interest. When the moral imperative acquires a certain amount of force, it isn't just simply expressed in relation to the Chinese Olympics, where you have this boycott, essentially to make a point to certain domestic players, certain domestic advocacy groups. Now, you can do that in relation to the Olympics, but when you do it fairly regularly, when that moralizing impulse becomes, is given far greater latitude to express itself, then it makes it much more difficult to resolve the crisis, because it always interferes with the decisions. And what I really worry about is that just when you get to the point of coming to an agreement, there will be all these domestic voices saying, oh, we've appeased Putin, oh, we appeased the Chinese. We haven't really looked after the interests of a particular individual in either China or Russia, which then makes it much more difficult for geopolitical debates and discussions to take place on a rational basis. And that's one of the important and relatively new developments that we now have to take into our calculations of how the future will unfold.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. Thanks again, Mary. I'm sure thanks from everybody, really, for a very informative and useful discussion. What I'd like to do just before I let everyone go is just remind you again that we at the Academy of Ideas are committed to holding these kinds of public and open discussions where we can thrash out some of these issues in a way that maybe they don't get discussed elsewhere. And we like to pride ourselves and think we do a relatively good job on that. And if you agree and you'd like to help us put on more of those kinds of discussions, then please, you can donate to the Academy of Ideas. You can also go on the Academy of Ideas website and sign up to our mailing list, where you'll hear about upcoming events and other sessions. You could also become an associate of the Academy of Ideas, where you could have a slightly closer relationship to us and get discounted tickets and all the rest of it for our in-person events as and when they happen. And then one further thing, which I just wanted to mention, an event that will be coming up, which tickets have just gone on sale for in July by the BOI charity, which I also work for, a charity I also work for. And that event is called the Academy where there will be a weekend of talks and discussions and seminars. But the reason why it's relevant tonight is because we will be looking very much at the way that, especially after the pandemic and in this period, international affairs and geopolitics has taken a very different turn. That link is in the chat. My colleagues put it there, I've just put it there as well. But also, of course, go to the Academy of Ideas website, sign up, stay in touch with us. You can follow us on Twitter as well. But thank you very much for tuning in tonight, and stay tuned. We'll make sure we get this out as a podcast for any of you who missed the beginning or the end, or somewhere in the middle. But thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks again for Mary and Frank. Have a good evening, everyone.